Welcome to From the Quarries. A couple of weeks ago, I published a short paper by Castells on Kabbalism, which was really a very light introduction to that massive field of research and scholarship. It's caused some small contention among the viewers, mainly I think because Castells' writing style is eccentric, to say the least, and quite confusing in some ways. Tonight we're going to take the first steps to address that by looking a bit more deeply at the Kabbalistic belief system, specifically as it relates to Freemasonry. So tonight's paper is entitled The Kabbalah and Freemasonry. It was written by Brother Reverend J.N. Cleland. I don't have a date for when the paper was published, but from the text it looks like it was the early half of the 20th century. It references the 1930s, so was presumably written in the late 1930s or 1940s. This work is a lot more dense and a lot more detailed than the Castells paper was, and for that reason I'll be splitting it into two videos, so it's not too much of an undigestible mass to get through in one sitting. So I hope you enjoy part one of the Kabbalah and Freemasonry.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation, From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore.
In his Prestonian lecture, Medieval Master Masons and Their Secrets for the year 1933, Brother Reverend W. Covey Crump brought to the notice of the craft the very important influence which was exercised by the school of Kabbalistic thought at the time of the formation of the 1717 Grand Lodge. Brother Covey Crump subsequently expanded his thesis in a paper delivered before the Masonic Study Society in London. Apart from this preliminary treatment of the subject, the study of the Kabbalah and its connection and parallels with Freemasonry has been neglected, with the result that little is known of it by members of our order. I have, therefore, in the present paper, endeavoured to repair the deficiency, and I trust that such light as I have been able to throw on the subject will be of assistance to other brethren who are also students of the inner meaning of our craft and its rituals. At the outset, I would like to say that in my opinion, it is doubtful whether any Kabbalistic doctrines or ideas were actually introduced into the Masonic system by such of our reformers as Ashmole, Flood, Montague, de Saglia, and the many others who were associated with the inauguration of the premier Grand Lodge. Rather, I would suggest that the Grand Lodge era represents the coalescence of a number of parallel channels through which the basic principles of the ancient wisdom had been transmitted through the Middle Ages, and which it was then decided under reservations to reveal a section of to the thinking public. This view receives confirmation from the works of authors who have previously written concerning the same subject, for nearly all of them admit that Kabbalism had some influence on the decisions made during the period of transition from operative to speculative. Even Brother Robert Freak Gould, overcautious as he is, concedes that Freemasonry might have received no slight tinge from those students of the Kabbalah who have been identified as being numbered among the leading minds of our order. These students, he informs us, were possibly more numerous than is generally supposed, and the larger the number, the greater is the probability that some of the more influential among them did indoctrinate their brethren with their peculiar wisdom. To sum up, the available evidence warrants the conclusion that long before the emergence of speculative Freemasonry as an organized society, the root principles of the ancient wisdom appear to have been grafted upon the decaying symbolism of the guild and fellowship of operative masonry in Kabbalistic guise. However, Before proceeding to demonstrate this close connection, which undoubtedly exists between Kabbalah and Freemasonry, I must give some indication of what the Kabbalah really is, because the average Masonic student has only a hazy idea for what purpose the doctrine was evolved. According to the definition contained in the Oxford Dictionary, the Kabbalah is Jewish oral tradition, mystic interpretation, esoteric doctrine, occult law. A better, more explicit definition perhaps is, the Kabbalah is the Judaic veil which hides from the vulgar gaze the wisdom of Israel. The word Kabbalah, however it is spelt, is derived from the Hebrew QBLH, the literal interpretation of which is unwritten or oral tradition, from the Hebrew verb QBL, to receive. In other words, a Kabbalist may be described as a student of the hidden meaning of scriptures, which he interprets by the aid of what is known as symbolical Kabbalah. It will not be possible in this paper to go into the history of the various schools of Hebrew mystics from whom the Kabbalistic tradition issued, but nevertheless it will be necessary to briefly refer to some of them. Among the best known are the Essenes, who are described by Philo as eminently worshippers of God, by which he means to imply that they essayed to keep their minds in a priestly state of holiness. Plato, speaking of the Essenes, also states that they study only that philosophy which pertains to the existence of God and the beginning of all things. Otherwise, they devote all their attention to ethics, using as their instructors the laws of their fathers, which, without the outpouring of the divine spirit, the human mind could not have devised. For, following their ancient traditions, they attained their philosophy by means of allegorical interpretations. Of the love of God, they exhibit myriads of examples, inasmuch as they strive for a continued, uninterrupted life of purity and holiness. No one possesses a house absolutely as his own, one which at the same time does not belong to all. For, in addition to living together in companies, their houses are also open to their adherents, coming from other quarters. They have one storehouse for all, and the same diet. Their garments belong to all in common, and their meals are taken in common. From this description, we may be pardoned if we commend them as an excellent example of the true practice of brotherly love, relief, and truth. The following characteristics of the Essenes are important in regard to our modern Freemasonry and should be carefully noted. 1. The great stress which they laid upon fellowship. 2. Their distinction from the general populace by their higher sanctity. 3. Their devotion to the study of the knowledge of God and of the beginning of all things. And 4. Their love of allegorical interpretation. These characteristics surely present a picture of Freemasonry as it ought to be. Another significant mystical group were known as the Hashaim, the secret ones. The members of this group reserved a room in their houses for the reception of a charity box, where money could be deposited or withdrawn in the utmost privacy. The contents of these charity boxes were collected and distributed by almoners, appointed for the purpose. A third group were the Vatican, men of firm principles, who are further described as men who were meek and carried out the commandment from pure love. Meekness here stands for something infinitely higher than the moral idea popularly associated with that term, and its attainment could only be realized after long and strenuous training. One of the most interesting phases of Hebrew mystical thought is that known as the MERKABAH, or Chariot mysticism, which is peculiarly associated with the interpretation of the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel. And here I would call attention to a very curious prohibition existing in regard to the inner meaning of the first chapters of the book of Genesis. It was absolutely forbidden to explain the secret doctrine to more than one person at a time. And, in the case of the MERKABAH law, it was also forbidden to divulge even to one by himself, unless he be a sage and of an original turn of mind. This prohibition is referred to by Rabbi YETZIRAH, who, writing in the 3rd century AD, declares, "We may not divulge even the first words of the chapters, unless it be to a chief of the Beth Din, House of Judgment, a technical name for the Jewish court of law, or to one whose heart is tempered by age and responsibility." Expressed Masonically, the prohibition applied to all those who were not of mature age, sound judgment, and strict morals. In the MERKABAH law, ministering angels figure prominently, especially one named Sandalaphon, a corruption of the Greek Sandelaphon, meaning co-brother. And this is significant from the point of view of Freemasonry. The idea of the Word of God becoming transformed into an angel and performing tasks among men is also found in the Logos doctrine expounded by Philo, and forms the proem of the Gospel according to St. John. It is likewise clearly linked with the conception of the spiritual marriage, human and divine, which figures largely in the alchemic and Rosicrucian philosophies. We may also note that in the Old Testament, Israel is consistently alluded to as the bride, while God is represented as the ideal bridegroom, arrayed in garments displaying the dignity of manhood. And here, in the profoundest mystical sense, we have a direct link with our Masonic tradition of the quest for the lost word. The later rabbinical epoch from circa 700 to 1100 AD was productive of a large mystical literature, one branch of which, the Hekkalot, Halls, is reputed to have had for its origin and inspiration Yeredei MERKABAH, riders in the Chariot. According to Dr. Louis Ginsberg, these mystics were able, by various manipulations, to enter into a state of auto-hypnosis, in which they declared that they saw heaven open before them and beheld its mysteries. The same writer also affirms, "It was also believed that he could not only undertake this MERKABAH ride, who was in possession of all religious knowledge, observed all the commandments and precepts, and was almost superhuman in the purity of his life. This, however, was regarded usually as a matter of theory, and less perfect men also attempted, by fasting and prayer, to free their senses from the impressions of the outer world, and succeeded in entering into a state of ecstasy in which they recounted their heavenly visions." Abelson, in his Jewish Mysticism, quoting this, points out that much of the belief still survives. Modern research assigns a much earlier date to the origins of MERKABAH mysticism, and it may well be that this is a syncretism of Hebrew, Mithraic, and Neoplatonic elements. The Kabbalah is the ancient Chaldean sacred doctrine, an occult tradition handed down by oral transmissions, but which, although accepting tradition, is not in itself composed only of traditional teachings. It was once a fundamental science, notwithstanding the undoubted fact that it is now disfigured by the additions and decretions of centuries, and by the interpolation of Western occultists, more especially those of Christian mystics. Originally, the Kabbalah was communicated only verbally, or from mouth to ear, and this became known as the theoretic Kabbalah. There also came into being a practical Kabbalah, which concerned itself largely with the interpretation of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, as images or types of sounds, of numbers and of ideals. History bristles with the names of learned and intellectual men who were students of the Kabbalah, including Paracelsus, Henry Kunrath, Jacob Boehme, Robert Flood, the two Van Helmonts, and of course Cornelius Agrippa. There are to be found cardinals, abbots, and even popes among the churchmen, and exponents of almost every branch of science and learning have numbered in the ranks, ranging from masters of the art to the merest dabblers. The origin of the Kabbalah is lost in the mists of antiquity, but there is evidence, even documentary, as far back as the rabbis of the Second Temple, 515 BC. Before that date, we have no proof or written records, and there is no hint of an author, nor any trace of its first teachers. Nevertheless, we do know that the Kabbalah must have existed for centuries in a very complete form before anything was committed to writing or otherwise recorded. One curious point to note is the way in which the Kabbalistic tradition has run parallel to, and yet kept distant from, the exoteric Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and also from the enormous mass of commentaries thereon, the Mishnah and Gemara, which together form the Talmud. The phenomenon is to be observed in India also, where the esoteric treatises, the Upanishads, grew alongside the purely exoteric Brahmins and Puranas. Indeed, it must be recognized that there has been, and always will be, a hidden side to religion. Even the Church of Rome, the name, if not the fact, is still retained in the term, the discipline of the secret. We now pass to a consideration of some of the main Kabbalistic works. First and foremost must be placed the SEPHER YETZIRAH, the Book of Formation, which is by far the oldest work extant in the Hebrew language. This book outlines a philosophical scheme of creation, bringing out parallels between the origin of the world, the sun, the planets, the chemical elements, and man. It also deals with the senses and other parts of the makeup of man. Herein, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet are divided into a triad, a heptad, and a dodecad, 3 mother letters, the foundation of the alphabet, and representing air, fire, and water, from which 3 basic elements all nature took form. 7 double letters, each expressing a double significance, and representing the 7 planets and other septenaries. 12 single or simple letters, corresponding to the months of the year, the zodiacal signs, and human organs. The SEPHER YETZIRAH is mentioned in both the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds, and it is written in that peculiar Neo-Hebraic language used in the Mishnah commentaries on the Pentateuch. Next in importance is the Zohar, the Book of Splendor or of Light, its very name recalling at once the emphasis which is placed upon the search for light in our modern Freemasonry, as well as the association with light as the central fact and object of quest and worship in ancient Egypt. The Zohar is a collection of separate treatises relating to souls, angels, cosmogony, and to God. There are many other Kabbalistic treatises, but the 2 books I have mentioned are the most important. The study of the Kabbalah reveals a 2-fold division, one part devoted to dogmatic and doctrinal research, and known as the Dogmatic Kabbalah, the other concerning itself with the practical or magical aspect, and described as the Practical Kabbalah. Both of these branches have produced many outstanding figures, and both have their representatives living today. The Dogmatic Kabbalah deals largely with philosophical conceptions of God, of angels, and of other beings, presumably more spiritual than man. It considers the human soul and its aspects and parts, and is devoted also to a study of pre-existence, reincarnation, and the division of the various planes of existence. The practical Kabbalah is concerned with the mystical and allegorical interpretation of the Old Testament, dealing exhaustively with each phrase, word, and letter, the connection between the letters and numbers, and the different modes of their interrelation. It also lays down the main principles of the three great sections of the science, of Noterican and Tamura. Further, the practical Kabbalah contains instructions for the making and use of amulets, magic squares, the use of the divine names, and those of the various orders of angels. One of the principal concepts found in the Kabbalah is the idea of a spiritual wisdom being reached by 32 paths, comprising 10 numbers and 22 letters. The 10 Sephiroth, or holy voices, chanting by the crystal sea, and the 22 occult forces of the universe. No exposition of Hebrew mysticism would be complete without a reference to the Shekinah mysticism. The Hebrew scriptures contain two basic elements of theological teaching: God conceived of as Father and conceived of as King. Being anxious to exclude oppressors of their people, the rabbis at first limited the conception of the fatherhood of God to Jews. But as the course of Hebrew history advanced and the mystical tradition widened, a more spiritualized conception gradually emerged, and the idea of divine parenthood became linked with that of a kingdom comprising the elect of God called out from all the nations. Nonetheless, in the rabbinical schools, the two conceptions, the fatherhood and the kingdom of God, found expression in the strict fellowship within the communal life, and this was the basis of the Shekinah mysticism. The word Shekinah is derived from the Hebrew root shakan, to dwell, and it symbolizes that divine human fellowship which only fails when the human partner is in sin. It involves what, in the words of Brother Lawrence, is described as the practice of the presence of God. A famous Hebrew exponent declares that the Shekinah only reside with him who is at once wise, strong, and wealthy, where wise indicates the perfection of spirituality, strong shows out the perfection of physical qualities, and wealthy, or as we are accustomed to call it, beautiful, denotes the perfection of the moral qualities. In the Old Testament, Numbers chapter 5, verses 24 to 26, the blessing pronounced by the priest is given in the terms of Shekinah mysticism. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee, and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee, and give thee peace. One of the best illustrations of underlying meaning of the Shekinah is contained in the passage which occurs in the book of Exodus, in chapter 20, verse 18. All the people saw the voice of God in various forms, for this links up the Hebrew conception with the Greek logos, or word. This idea of visible speech appears quite often in scripture and mystical literature, and the implication is that the phenomenon was not a vocal vibration, but was, as it were, a ray of virtue, so exceedingly brilliant as to be beyond the capacity of the rational faculty. The same idea is also sometimes expressed in terms of smell, as Aaron's rod is said to have smelt the Shekinah. Kabbalistically, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet are used to illustrate or veil the theosophic or doctrinal element. The three letters which play the principal part in this are Aleph, Mem, and Shin, and these are called mother letters, because they signify the three divisions into which the alphabet naturally forms. 1. Mutes, possessing of themselves no sound except in combination with a vowel. M will be found to be merely a compression of the lips. 2. Sibilants, or hissing sounds, denoted by sh. And 3. Aspirants, which the ancient theosophists hold to be the intermediate between the two groups. A was taken to represent this group. All other letters are held to be born from the three mothers, and these were associated with the three primordial elements. Mem with water, because the chief product of water is fish, and fish are the mute creation. Shin with fire, from the hissing of the flames, and Aleph with air, as having an airy, vacant pronunciation, holding the balance between mute and sibilant, as air holds the balance between fire and water. Speaking of these mother letters, the SEPHER YETZIRAH says of them, "The heavens were produced from fire, the earth from water, and the air from the spirit is as a reconciler between the fire and the water. From the fire was made heat, from the water was made cold, and from the air was produced the temperate state, again a mediator between them." From the three mother letters come forth 7 double letters: Beth, Gimel, Daleth, Kaf, Pei, Resh, and Tau, each embodying the characteristics of the sacred planets. And just as we have a double aspect and influence, so the 7 double letters have 2 aspects, or their hard and soft sounds, which modify the meaning of the words in which they are used. There are, finally, 12 simple letters, which are associated with the 12 signs of the zodiac. He, Vav, Zain, Cheth, Teth, Yod, Lamed, Nun, Samech, Oin, Zadi, and Kuf. These simple letters give special force to the words in which they are used, modified by the varying power of the double letters in the word, just as the 12 houses give significance to a horoscope, but are modified by the position of the planets in each house. Hence, the 12 simple letters represent the 12 properties or potencies which make up the Earth's aura, while the 7 double letters, like the 7 planets, represent the 7 Elohim, oppressed through the 7 nature notes and the 7 colors into which the one light, or Yod, is broken up. It is significant to note that the division of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet into groups of 3, 7, and 12 letters respectively corresponds to the number of units shown on the 3 parts of the traditional form of the true cross, viz., 3 units the upper arm, 7 the crossbar, and 12 the upright below the crossbar. We may now consider the Kabbalah in the light of the 2 main divisions, the dogmatic and the practical, but must not lose sight of the fact that the whole teaching is based upon the assumption that every sentence, phrase, word, and letter of the Hebrew Pentateuch is divinely inspired, and that no yod nor tittle may be changed or neglected. One of the most famous of the 17th century rabbis, Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, compares the Mosaic books to the body of a man, the Mishnah or commentaries to his soul, and the Kabbalah to the spirit inhabiting the soul. Simon ben Yochai says, "Woe unto the man who sees in the Torah nothing but simple narratives and ordinary words. For if, in truth, it contained only that, we should have been able, even today, also to compose a Torah, which would be, in very much another way, worthy of regard. In order to find simple statements, we should only have to betake ourselves to the ordinary legislators, among whom we could find valuable words in even greater quantity. It would suffice us to imitate them and to make a law after their words and example. But it is not thus. Every word of the Torah contains an elevated sense and a sublime mystery. He also affirms, the narratives of the law are but the garments of the law. Woe unto him who takes this garment for the law itself. It is in this sense that David spoke, saying, Open thou mine eyes, that I may behold wondrous things out of thy law, in Psalm 119, verse 18. There are fools who, seeing a man covered with a beautiful garment, look no further than that. And yet that which gives a worth to the garment is his body. And what is more precious than that? His soul. The law, too, has its body. There are precepts which one might call the body of the law. The ordinary narratives which are intermingled are the garments with which the body is covered. Simpletons have regard only to the garments or narratives of the law. The better instructed pay no regard to the garment, but to the body which it encloses. Finally, the wise, the servants of the Supreme King, they who inhabit the heights of Sinai, are concerned only with the soul, which is the foundation of all else, which is the real law. I have already mentioned that there are 3 methods of interpretation applicable to the practical Kabbalah, and as much in Freemasonry is undoubtedly concealed under Kabbalistic veils, it is desirable that students should know something about them. The following, therefore, is a brief explanation suitable as an introduction for beginners. That was part 1 of the Kabbalah and Freemasonry by J.N. Cleland. I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. Next week, we'll move on to part 2, commencing with the promised brief explanation suitable as an introduction for beginners. If you enjoy this sort of content, please do consider subscribing to From the Quarries. We publish short videos pretty much every day, long-form videos once a week, and there's a very active discussion group working in the YouTube channel with quizzes and brain teasers, conundrums and challenges. We'd love to see you join us. That's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed yourselves, and I'll see you with part 2 next week.